turn to the book of Esther as we're making our way through Esther. We are close to nearing the end here at Esther chapter number 8. You know, oftentimes we pray, and we even pray, give us this day our daily bread, that God will provide for us, that God will take care of us, that God will give us what we need. But God uses means, God uses ways in order to provide for us, and one of the ways He provides for us is through wisdom. Through us being able to use our own intuition, our own reason, our own logic, our own understanding and experience, so that we can know how to navigate this world. God works not only in the big miracles, He also leads in giving us guidance, giving us direction, knowing how to follow Him, knowing how to do ministry together and to the world. Esther is a good example of wisdom. In fact, I find it very interesting that in the book of Proverbs, the personification of wisdom is a woman. And all the wives say amen to that. That there is a nature in which wisdom leads us, and it directs us, and it guides us. And Esther needed wisdom in her dire and dangerous situation. We have just read in previous weeks how there was this decree to go out to kill all the Jews and plunder all their goods. And the Queen Esther wisely was able to have this meeting and this feast to kind of butter up the king with Haman there. And Haman was all distraught because Mordecai would not bow down to him. And so he made this huge gallows to kill and execute Mordecai on. And then just last week we saw that Queen Esther accused Haman in the front of the king. Haman himself fell all over the king while the king was coming back into the room, and he thought she was assaulting her, and he hung Haman himself on those gallows. It was Haman's very, very bad day. So that starts off on this same day in Esther chapter number 8. Let's read verse number 1. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and wept and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman the Agagite and the plot that was devised against the Jews. When the king held out the golden scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king. And she said, "If it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, which he wrote to destroy the Jews that are in all the province of the king. For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred?" Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, "Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring, for an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked." The king's scribes were summoned at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day, and an edict was written according to all that Mordecai commanded concerning the Jews, to the satraps and to the governors and the officials of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to each province in his own script, and to each people in his own language, and also to the Jews in their script and their language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring. Then he sent the letters by mounted couriers riding on swift horses that were used in the king's service, bred from the royal stud, saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. On one day throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, a copy of what was written was to be issued as a decree in every province, being publicly displayed to all peoples. And the Jews were to be ready on that day to take vengeance on their enemies. So the couriers, mounted on their swift horses that were used in the king's service, rode out hurriedly, urged by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Susa the citadel. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king, his royal robes of blue and white, and a great golden crown, and a robe of fine linen and purple, and the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. And the Jews had light and gladness, and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, where the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many of the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. So the first thing that we see in this passage is that wisdom gives clarity. And we see this in verses 1 through 8. We see that Haman was killed. However, the danger of Haman had not disappeared. In fact, Haman himself was minor in comparison to the danger that Haman's law proposed. This law was to destroy and eradicate every single Jew in the whole empire. That's more dangerous than a single man is. And sometimes laws of empires can be more dangerous than individuals are. The evil work of Haman was still in full effect. And the evil law to commit genocide on the Jews and to steal their property. Esther must again speak up. She spoke up when she went before the king, not knowing her life was going to be saved. She spoke up to enact a party to talk to the king. She spoke up to accuse Haman in front of the king's face, and her job is not yet done. While she herself is safe, and Mordecai is safe, her people are not. She must speak up this time, though, not against Haman, but against the law that the king himself agreed to. If anything, this is a more dangerous time to speak up because you essentially have to say, "Oh, king, you were wrong. You were manipulated. You were lured by Haman and his promise for riches, and you did something that was bad." Sometimes we must point out to authority that they are wrong. There is a role for the church to be a prophetic voice in the culture, to point at leadership and say, this is wrong, this is sinful, this is wicked, this is not in line with the laws of God. Just as John the Baptist stood against the tyrant King Herod and said, what you are doing in your palace by marrying your brother's wife is a sin and wicked and contrary to the laws of God. And while that sounds courageous and bold, also remember what happens to men like John the Baptist. His head was cut off for speaking against that political ruler. Well, we also must not be swayed by the power of the threat of a sword, but have the boldness to speak to our culture and to our society, to say that right is right and wrong is wrong. But how we do that takes wisdom. Sometimes it's easy to say, well, like Elijah against the prophets of Baal, I'm just going to go and burn the whole house down. I'm just going to go yell at everybody and shout at them. However, that would not have worked in Esther's case. In Esther's case, such an action would probably have just led to the murder of the Jews still. Instead, Esther needed wisdom in how to speak to authority. And we too need wisdom in how to speak into our culture. Notice how she does it. She doesn't even actually say she's wrong. What does she do? She says the issue is wrong. The problem is what's wrong. Not you, O king. Oh, you, king, are great. You're fantastic. But this issue still needs to be fixed. Even though this situation only existed because the king himself allowed himself to be manipulated because of greed, if all Esther did was call him out, the only thing that would have succeeded would be to exalt the king. And the question we have to ask ourselves in wisdom is when we're dealing with these issues in our society and our culture, what do we care about more? Merely telling authority what we think about them, or actually bringing about change, actually affecting things? Sometimes that means we need to hold our tongues on personal attacks towards others, so that the more important issues can actually be heard by authorities and dealt with. And this is true for authorities in government, authorities at your work, authorities in the church. Sometimes we need to hold our tongues on what we want to tell people what we think about them in order so that we can actually deal with what's important. But in order to do that in wisdom, you need to know what's important. What really matters? Is it blowing off steam and telling someone off? Or is it something deeper and more significant? Something that matters more than just that? This takes clarity to know what is the actual issue. This takes meditation and thought of how to approach things. But for Esther, it's crystal clear. She is there to save her people. That is the goal. Anything else would merely be a distraction from that goal. That's why every organization, including churches, have mission statements so we don't drift off into some other realm of something that we're not supposed to do. We need to have a crystal clear view of what it is we're supposed to be doing. And Esther did. Mouthing off and saying, "I told you so" to the king does absolutely nothing to save her people, and that's what she cares about. What do you care about? Is it some of these other issues of telling people off and what you think about them, of clickety-clacking on the internet to say your opinion? Or is it the advancement of God's kingdom and the spreading of his gospel? That should matter more to us than anything else, and that should give us laser-focused clarity on how we should conduct ourselves in this world. Who really cares about what the king thinks about himself? Who cares about that he has an inflated ego? She doesn't deal with any of that. Giving him insults isn't going to change his character. And oddly enough, that's what we think sometimes, that the more we can insult somebody, then they're going to just change. But the opposite always happens. They just get more entrenched in whatever viewpoint that they have. Especially, she doesn't want to insult his character when she's in a place now that she can actually be heard. The problem that she had and she was concerned about was right in front of her face. To throw away that opportunity would be foolish. You see, Esther, one of the reasons she isn't telling off the king is because Esther isn't speaking for herself. She's saved. She's saved. Mordecai, her cousin/uncle, is saved. He's safe. He's okay. He's now has more authority and power than he ever had before. Esther is speaking for those who cannot enter the room, the ones that do not have a voice in front of the king. And we must use our influence in our society for those who cannot speak for themselves. We mentioned last week about the atrocity of abortion, those who literally cannot speak for themselves, but we can. We can be their voice. We can speak out for them. But not even on large issues like that, but even in your own workplace. Do you have an ear to a manager? That some injustice is being done, that some wrong is being done, that someone is being overlooked or abused or underutilized even. It doesn't even have to be a sinful thing, but someone else that you can lift up and elevate into a position that they will thrive in. Do you have an ear for a manager to talk to them? To speak and advocate not just for yourself, but for others? To lift them up? Esther is speaking for others. She shows her tears to the king. She cries to the king. And this crying is not manipulation. This is not crocodile tears of eliciting some emotion. It is also not tears of weakness. Rather, it is tears of moral clarity. She knows the atrocity that is about to happen, a complete genocidal slaughter of her people. And that moral clarity produces in her a rush of emotions, which is tears before the king. And then the king does something here. He, of course, gives the pen, the royal pen, to the queen and says, well, write your law. So kind of a not quite auto pen situation here. If you write it down, I'll sign it sort of thing. But notice that Mordecai is put into authority. Mordecai, that it says, Mordecai the Jew. That's his moniker. That's what he's known as now. Why is that important? Because who is going to be slaughtered? Well, the Jews were going to be slaughtered. Mordecai is a representative of his people and of this people that is now in an elevated place of authority. He actually understands the people that he is called to serve, unlike Haman. Who was Haman? Haman only cared about Haman. He cared about himself. He cared that other people weren't bowing and groveling before his presence. Not once do we see anything about Haman in the whole book of Esther that he cared about anybody other than Haman himself. He didn't advocate for the people, Jew or non-Jew. He didn't advocate for other Persians. He didn't advocate for anybody. He didn't even advocate for his friends or his wife. He advocated for himself. Mordecai, though, actually wants to serve the population that he is placed over. You see, wisdom in this means that God's kingdom is often spread by empowerment and sanctioning responsibilities, not merely by centralizing control. And to make this applicable to us, because we can look at, government shouldn't have centralized control and all this other kind of stuff and blah, 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 but we don't have much effect over those things. But we do have effect here in Reformation Church, in our community, our communion that God had put us together in. And this means that for us to advance God's kingdom, which is part of our vision statement, for us to talk about that vision that we had of planting churches and growing so the spreading of the gospel can occur in surrounding communities, that means we need to empower the most people that we possibly can. You know, in the hospital, there's this idea about working at the top of your license. So, for instance, if you're a nurse, nurses have various scope of practice that they can do. However, you want them to work at the top of their license, meaning the most complex tasks that they can do, and delegate lower tasks to other people, such as, people that clean the rooms and stuff like that. While a nurse can clean a room, you're not utilizing that nurse to the best of their ability. You really want to use them at the best and highest level of their skill. Well, so too, in this church, we have tons of people, all of you, each and every one of you, have been given gifts by God. It says so in the book of Corinthians. You've been given spiritual gifts. And before we get wrapped up in what my spiritual gift is, the important thing is you have something you should be doing for God and can be doing, and maybe already are doing it and don't even realize it. Pastor Skip and I and the deacons and the leadership of the church want to empower you to do it and more than what you've been doing already. Not as another burden, but as a life-giving fulfillment of what God has called you to do. That we want to sanction you in your responsibilities, that it's good what you're doing. We don't want to centralize control in ourselves. We don't want everything to depend on Pastor Skip and myself. We don't want to be the dictators that rule every single thing that happens in the church. Rather, we want to mobilize and empower you as a congregation because God has placed you here for a reason. Healthy leadership asks, who needs to be given authority so that they can act faithfully? Some people, authority prohibits them from acting faithfully. Rather, we want to empower you so that you can act faithfully. Here's a clue about that, though, that question. The one who is moving to do it is the one more authority should be given to. And so those that are already serving, those that are already promoting, those that are already using their gifts or talents or service to other people, those are the ones that more authority should be heaped upon. That's the model of Jesus, to who much is given, much shall be required. If you are simply one that waits for some kind of authority before you do anything, well, then after you get the authority, you're not going to do anything with it anyway. Do what God has for you now so that we can see that, the body can recognize that, and then we can empower and sanction you for even more ministry and more authority. Those who think, well, once I get the position, then I'll act on it, are the ones that won't do the right thing after they even have it. Giving authority is so that ministry can increase, not as an excuse for someone to never start a ministry. It's so that a ministry can grow. And we want to empower you. Point number 2, wisdom provides realistic options. Real options, not just what we would want it to do. Notice here, so we have the king gives the letter, and they are to make a law in order to fix the law that Haman enacted. Sometimes problems need creative thinking. That takes wisdom. The reason why is because the law, remember, cannot be changed. You cannot change Persian law, and the law already went out that every single Jew should be destroyed and obliterated and should plunder their goods. So what do you do if you can't repeal the law? The reason why is what was a safeguard against the flippant laws of the king. It should have been a measure to him knowing I can't change laws once I write them, therefore I should be very careful about the laws I enact. That didn't work in this case. But it's also so that the kings could maintain authority and power as if, oh, I never make mistakes. I always say the right thing. So, just getting rid of the bad law wasn't an option. They had to think around the problem, not just through the problem. Simplistic answers of, well, just don't do that then. Just stop. Or, sometimes we hear the if everyone would just. Well, everyone's not going to just do whatever it is. That can't be the solution for a problem. If everyone would just give to this cause, if everyone would just march in this thing, if everyone would just share the gospel, if everyone would do just, it's not going to work that way. It's not dealing with reality, and wisdom deals with reality. If we only have those kinds of answers of just do this, just do that, as if it's a simplistic problem, we'll never deal with what is real. They are fantasy answers that don't actually do us any good. They had to assess the limits of what they could do, which is just what we need to do. Assess the limits of what we can and can't do. They couldn't change the law, for instance. They had to identify what remaining options they had to work with. For instance, they could write a new supplement to the law. So they couldn't change the law, but they could amend that law and add further details. They acted devisedly then with the options that they had. They knew the problem, they came up creatively with the solution, and then they acted on it. And Reformation Church, it's the same with us. There's many things. Man, I can fantasize about the wonderful resources and facilities and programs and things that we could have and what we could do if we had all of these things. But that's merely fantasy. That's not reality. God has, though, He has given us resources. He has given us facility. He has given us ways in which to spread the gospel. And so we need to focus on what we do have more than what we don't have. Now, it's always okay to plan and dream and try to move things to make them happen. However, God has given us what He has given us in His grace, in His mercy. He has abundantly provided for us. So how can we use what the gifts, talents, people that we have for His ministry service? We do not live in a perfect world. Too often, we deal with problems, though, whether interpersonal or otherwise, only in the ideal as if we do live in a perfect world. If everyone was righteous, if everyone did what they were supposed to, if we had all the resources we would ever want, and if everything fell into place, this is how it should happen. We need to deal with reality, though, which is always less than ideal. Because we live in a sinful and a broken world. While we may try to get as close to ideal as possible, we have to acknowledge that sometimes we can only get closer to what's best than actually what the ideal is. For instance, let me give you an illustration for this. And this is just one illustration out of many. The Bible commands that parents should raise up their children in the things of the Lord. That is a command of God that a parent ought to do. There are many different expressions of that, however. Perhaps in our setting that we think of and that my family enjoys in, the most ideal is the idea of homeschooling, that a mother and a father can pour into their children right where they are, in their homes. That's an ideal. However, there are those who simply may not be able to. Perhaps their life schedule will not allow for it. Maybe husband and wife both work and there is no time, or perhaps someone is a widower and only doesn't have a spouse that can help them. Or they just don't have the aptitude, or they don't have somehow that they can work to stay at home. Well, Christian schooling is a viable option for that then. Not to abdicate your authority. You still have a duty to teach your children, to raise them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. However, here is another option. It's maybe less than the ideal if we use those terms. However, we need to get as close to the ideal as possible. Even then, let's say there's a single mother who is exceedingly poor and cannot afford the tuition of a Christian school. What if there is legal trouble and controversy of custody from past relationships? Because once again, we live in a sinful world that is not ideal. We need to live in realism. What if there are major health issues where both financially and logistically they cannot get someone to a Christian school? Well, then the only options left may be some public online or in-person school. Far less than ideal. Far, far less than ideal. However, we try to get as close to the ideal as possible using wisdom and dealing with reality. If all we do with someone that's in that kind of situation is say, well, then you need to homeschool as the application, all we do is lay a burden on them that they cannot possibly bear. And this can be applied to relationships, to churches, to all the different things that we deal with, living in what the reality is. The command to raise your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord does not change. It still stands. However, because we live in a sinful, broken world, the way in which we do that may change. The application may change. Our reality might be less than ideal, so we work with what we can do rather than fixated on what we can't do. This also means that we need to be kind and non-judgmental to those who are doing the best they can in non-ideal situations. Wisdom asks, what does being faithful look like in the reality of my life, not the fantasy of my life? Last point, wisdom provides hope to us. So there was, of course, communication. You got these, finest horses imaginable. I was going to say the Mustang of horses, but Mustang is a horse. So anyway, the Mustang of Mustangs that are charging out to give this decree. And what the decree was merely, the Jews can defend themselves. That's the decree. And that might sound like a weird decree. Couldn't they do that anyway? Well, the problem is, if all it was, and we'll get into this when we get into chapter number 9, is that if the law was you can destroy all the Jews, then people are sanctioned to do that. And if Jews defended their lives and killed someone in the process, they could still be killed by the civil government. And so this law merely said, well, Jews, you can defend yourself, and that gives a limit to the sinful intentions of man. So they send out this law throughout all of the provinces. And what is marked here, especially verse 16, it says the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. In fact, they create a new holiday. This is the holiday, the Feast of Purim. This is not one that God declared you must do. He didn't say, thou shalt celebrate this holiday. They created a holiday because of this amazing event where God still worked behind the scenes to save all of his people. Every time holidays come around, sometimes, well, should Christians celebrate this thing, or even sometimes, Easter or Good Friday or all that. It is a mark of wisdom and joy to create holidays that are God-honoring. There's nothing wrong with that. It's good and healthy for people to do so, just as the Jews did here. Wisdom, you see, creates joy that needs expression, external expression. It's not the wise person that is the sad, negative, discouraging person all the time. It is not a mark of wisdom to even see all the problems and be able to nitpick everything. That's easy to do. Wisdom finds hope and solutions past the problems. Light here, this word, means clarity instead of confusion. They had visibility instead of being in hiding. They had vitality in them rather than being riddled with anxiety. They had hope again for the future. This means that fear was no longer the dominant emotion in their life. Are you riddled with anxiety? Pray to the Lord for wisdom to deal in reality so that you may be filled with hope and direction from God. And then he uses two words that are very similar, gladness and joy in Hebrew. This is joy, but in different ways. The first, translated as gladness here, means an inward settled gladness. Internally, you are smiling. You are glad. It's like when you're dreading a work event or a meeting, I don't want to go to. I hate going to that thing. And then you get in your car, and the event is over, and you can breathe. Even if the meeting went bad, if it went horrible, at least it's over with now, and I don't got to think about it. Well, so too, they breathed a sigh of relief We now have gladness inside of us because the dominant threat is now over. Then there was this translation here of what it says is joy, which is actually the outward expressing of actions of rejoicing. So they had both internal joy and externally that joy showed itself. This is good and honorable to express how you actually feel. We can externally express our emotions and feelings to one another. It is not a mark of a Christian to be merely stoic and unemotional about everything. That is, in fact, a mark of a stoic man, a Greek philosopher, a pagan way of thinking, and is not how you were meant to live. You are meant to live vibrantly and full of life, expressing yourself in all the ways that God has created you. And this joy then must be felt internally and then expressed publicly to others. For instance, something that's kind of a running joke in the church. However, if you're at a wedding celebration, then act like it. Get on the dance floor and dance. Enjoy yourself. Show that this is something that is worth being joyful and glad about, and showing that publicly and expressing it. It also says that they had honor. This is also what Esther's wisdom gave to them. You notice, the Jews didn't earn this from themselves. Because Esther was wise, they benefited from her wisdom. Others can benefit from your wisdom, more past just only yourself. They had honor, meaning they now had weight, value, and dignity in the eyes of the culture around them and how others regarded them. This honor, though, was not in spite of their light, not in spite of their internal gladness and external expressions of joy, but because of it. Because they rejoiced in the sight of other people and they saw they were glad, that meant that other people now held them in honor. Some of the things that stop us from expressing ourselves often is because we think, well, what are people going to think of me? Maybe they'll hold you with honor and dignity because of how you express yourself. Sometimes we refuse to act on our happiness because of how people will think. However, that is more dignified than bottling everything up and shoving it all down. The reverse is often true. Joy is infectious. Joy seeps into other people. Joy motivates other people. Just like being on the dance floor at a wedding motivates other people to also do the same thing. Lastly, in closing, the ultimate hope we have is the hope of the gospel. It is the ultimate act of wisdom is the gospel. That all these prophecies of the Old Testament that we didn't possibly understand, how were they all going to fit together? Jesus surprised the Pharisees, the scribes, the Jewish rulers, the Romans. He surprised even the devil himself with how everything of his life perfectly fulfilled and lined up with all of these prophecies in the Old Testament. Just one example, scholars of the Old Testament, the Pharisees, racked their brains on how could it say that the Messiah came from Bethlehem, but then it also said that the Messiah will come out of Egypt, I have called my son. How is that possible? Well, we know in the gospel story that he was born in Bethlehem because of Herod, ran over to Egypt, and then came back out of Egypt after Herod had died. Perfectly fulfilling this. The wisdom of God had orchestrated history so that even things that seemed contradictory made perfect sense. And so too, how could we who are sinful people, how could we ever be saved from the wrath of a holy and righteous God? Well, Jesus Christ, who was God and is God, became man. He bridged that gap that no one ever could. No other creature, no other angel could ever do this. However, the God-man came, stood in the gap between God and man by himself, took on our sin, and paid the wrath that only he could take so that we could be saved. Jesus himself, you know what it says of Jesus? In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. It says, that word there is logos, the logic of God, the reason of God, the mind of God. In other words, the wisdom of God became flesh and dwelt among us. He is the very embodiment of wisdom itself is in the gospel that we believe and trust. So, church, let us seek after wisdom. Let us seek clarity in our day. Let us seek to use real options that are in front of us. And let us have an undying, expressive, joyous hope because of what Jesus has done. Let us pray. Lord God, we thank you that you say that you give wisdom to those who ask and that you give it generously. And so, Lord, give us, Reformation Church, every person in it that's represented by it, give us wisdom. And let us have that hope that comes from you, that we may face this world, this broken and fallen world, with the wisdom that gives us joy, that gives us safety and security, that we can be dominated by hope and not fear because of what you had done. In Jesus' name, amen.